The clear light of day. We're on part 4, which starts at the beginning of chapter 2. The next 18 months went by so swiftly for Esme. The ancient seasons of the liturgical year, with its balance of fasts and feasts, resting lightly on older pagan foundations, wove in with the slightly different rhythms and observances of the Methodist calendar. In her new pastoral appointment, she went softly with the inevitable changes her personality brought. She had been asked at her first interview with the circuit stewards, "What will you do for the young people? What will you do to involve the Sunday school in worship? What will you do to improve the profile of the church in the community? What will you do about the falling numbers at Wiles Green?" And her answer to all those questions had been, "Nothing. I will watch and wait and listen. Nothing for a year, at the very least. And then, when I've seen enough to understand, where change seems helpful, it can begin. But at first, nothing. Until they trust me. Let them get familiar with the sound of my voice." One of the strangest and most surprising things to Esme in her first probationer appointment had been the unsettling accuracy of the simile describing a congregation and their pastor as sheep and shepherd. The relationship centres in the voice of the shepherd. "My sheep know my voice," Jesus had said once, long ago, and Esme had grown up thinking that to be a reference to spiritual call, but she had found it in practice to be simpler and more basic than that. When a faith community comes to know and trust their leader, that leader's voice can bring them to peace. As the pastor's voice opens the worship of the community, the trust implicit in the relationship gathers the people of God into one, so that their prayer and praise arises in one peaceful drift of incense smoke finding its way to heaven. In her first year and a half with her new congregations, already there had been the usual trickle of domestic tragedies and small emergencies. A troubled mother had poured out to Esme her concerns about a child truanting from school and making friends on the fringes of the drug world. There had been 2 bereavements in Portland Street families, 1 infant death, and one of her Brockhurst Priory pastoral visitors who had died after a very swift illness. At Wiles Green, a much-loved member of the congregation in her 90s had been diagnosed with cancer, Gladys Taylor, a sweet and gentle white-haired lady who hosted the Bible study in her small room in the almshouses by St. Raphael's Church. Gladys, unfailingly kind and understanding, restored Esme's faith in old ladies. It was with a pang of real sadness that she heard of the diagnosis. As Esme spent time with these and others passing through trouble and anxiety, the word went round that when they needed her, she came. She chaired her business meetings with competence, insisting that they close no later than 9:30, 20 minutes to 10 if any other business turned out heated. Her stewards in all 3 chapels worked well with her, and all her pastoral visitors did their work with diligence. The usual cold wars and simmering feuds seemed temporarily dormant, and after 18 months, Esme relaxed enough to consider her own life, beyond the occasional visit to her mother on her day off, or window shopping and enjoying a cappuccino in Brockhurst Priory. Her minister's diary was printed to span well beyond a year, and though she had begun her new one in September at the beginning of the Methodist year, the old one still lay handy on her desk, ready for when she needed it to transfer the details of this year's engagements made far in advance. She intended to trawl through, noting down all appointments still forthcoming and all the valuable margin notes of addresses and telephone numbers and personal details. But so far she hadn't found the time, and last year's diary had not yet outlived its usefulness. In February, as Lent began, Esme looked in her old diary, the one that had been new when she sat at her desk on those August days at the beginning of this appointment, to check the memoranda pages for details of services and study courses held jointly with churches of other denominations at this season of the year. And as she flicked through the pages, she came across her long-forgotten entry. Bikes. Jabez Ferrell, Wiles Green, behind the old police house, 50 yards beyond the pub. She paused and reread it and looked at it for a while. The watery sun of early spring streamed through the window onto her desk. The tree that overhung her driveway was developing sticky red buds that one day soon would unfurl in crumpled new green leaves. When she drove out to Wiles Green for Sunday worship or to lead the Wesley Guild, the dog Mercury was advancing cautious early shoots on the verges of the lanes. The air smelt fresh and inviting. A bike, she thought. Why not? Not today, but one day soon. And time went on, but the idea stayed with her, so that on the Tuesday of Holy Week, before the days erupted into the liturgical marathon of Maundy Thursday, Good Friday and Holy Saturday, culminating in Easter Sunday's multiple Eucharists, Esme made a space to investigate the possibility of buying a bike. It must be somewhere near here, then. Nosing through the narrow street, Esme tried to be mindful of the traffic and look out for the old police house at the same time. With almost nothing to boast in the way of commercial premises at Wiles Green, the pub stood out proudly, and a bit beyond the pub, 50 yards, no more, set back a little from the road, Marcus had said. Esme pulled up at the roadside, just straddling what pavement there was, and found that the square and solid pink-painted house behind the neatly trimmed privet hedge alongside her car bore an engraved plate, Old Police House. So the unmade track, half grown with weeds and rutted with potholes that disappeared round the back of the house, must be the path she was looking for. She climbed out of the car and looked up the little lane. Walking up it, She passed on her left the old police house, and on her right the brick wall that formed the side of the house that fronted the road. A few tender shoots of early weeds and the hopeful beginnings of buddleia sprouted from the base of the wall. Ahead of her, self-seeded hawthorns and elder overhung the path. She could smell wood smoke. Beyond the limits of the back garden walls that flanked the way, the path finished at a low picket fence, lichened and leaning with age, pushed out of place somewhat by an unruly planting of lavender, rosemary and sage, and a confused burden of honeysuckle vines that sprouted the very beginnings of their leaves among the dry, climbing, thorny stems of wild rose. Behind this fence, 2 gnarled apple trees bowed over the tangle of grass and herbs. A few brown hens wandering there muttered to each other and remarked on the finds their fierce eyes detected in the undergrowth. In the fence, a gate stood ajar, opening onto a damp brick path, home to a multitude of small early weeds, and leading directly to the front door of a cottage. The cottage windows were small and low, the walls red brick, and the door painted green. On the lintel of this door, a hand-painted sign said, Jabez Ferrell, Bicycle Repairs, and a grey weathered table to the left of the door held a collection of jars with a card propped against them that read, Local honey, alongside a tray of eggs, a cardboard basket of last year's apples, and a jam jar for callers to leave their money. Esme pushed the gate fully open, half surprised to find it swung silently, hung precisely on perfectly oiled hinges. She took a few steps along the brick path and stopped, entranced. Whoever lived here? Something in the sight of it tugged at the heart of her. It looked peaceful and simple, quiet and left to be, and a green fragrance of herbs and earth hung about it all. Entirely still on the path she stood and took it all in and loved it. Can I help you? The quiet voice with its country burr startled her, coming from behind, and she turned quickly, flustered momentarily by a sense that she had intruded, an unfamiliar sensation to her these days, accustomed by years of pastoral visiting to a warm and grateful reception by people in any state. I'm so glad I came here, thought Esme, as she looked at the owner of the voice. I am so glad I didn't miss this in my life. Mr. Ferrell, she said. Jabez Ferrell looked at her shyly, a little sideways, from under his eyebrows, which were wiry and silver grey. He would have made 5 feet 7 inches in his work boots if he had not stood with the habit of years slightly hunched. Clothed in faded and shabby green corduroy trousers below a battered brown waxed cotton jacket that was far too big for him, his hair in a waterfall of silver and white almost to his waist, and his beard straggling to a stop somewhere in the middle of his chest. Esme could almost have believed one of the characters from her childhood fairy stories had come to life before her. She gazed at him in delight. He stood his ground, but something in his habitual stance gave the odd impression that he was backing away from her. Very bright and clear was his glance when his eyes briefly met hers, a half-formed impression of something very transparent and truthful, and yet wary. No, guarded, no, only shy, Esme thought. Yes, he said, and again, can I help you? My name's Esme Brown. I'm the Methodist minister for the chapel here. Esme registered in herself a sense of surprise as Jabez Farrell inclined his head slightly. The smallest movement, but clearly indicating this was not news. And I'd like to buy a bicycle. I was recommended to come here. A flicker of amusement came into his eyes. From me? He said. Who told you to come to me to buy a bike? Esme felt mildly irritated. He didn't seem to be taking her seriously. Well, it's what you do, isn't it? She rejoined crisply. Bicycle repairs? Yes, but... He looked at the ground a moment, and when he raised his face to glance at her again, the flicker of amusement had become a lopsided grin. Come and have a look. The path was narrow for two people to pass, and Jabez Farrell hesitated. Once again the bright look he darted at her gave her the odd feeling of coming from behind something, from a place of hiding, as though he saw her more accurately than she might have wished, but kept himself hidden. Shall I come by you? He asked, and stepped onto the grass to pass in a careful circle around her. This way. He looked over his shoulder at her, and she followed him along the path, which progressed from brick to gravel and mud between a vigorous growth of assorted weeds around the back of the cottage to a yard paved with stone flags. They crossed the yard, passing the back door of the cottage, where a cast-iron frame supporting an old-fashioned grindstone stood against the wall, to the entrance of a long, low shed, built out from the side of the cottage and in the same red brick. As they went across the yard, Esme looked at the small and antiquated green open truck that stood parked rather haphazardly against the hedge that bordered the yard. Does he paint everything green? She wondered. Perhaps he's had a job lot to use up. The memory stirred somewhere. Hadn't she seen that truck before? Following Jabez into the shed, which was his workshop, Esme stopped for a moment to allow her eyes to adjust to the gloom. A window, not very big, was set into the same wall as the door, but Esme thought he could have done with at least one large roof light. Inside the workshop, the walls were lined entirely with a combination of shelves storing an assortment of containers, rusty biscuit tins mostly, and margarine tubs relabelled with paper and adhesive tape, and things hanging from nails hammered into the brickwork, bicycle parts, machine parts, garden implements and tools. In the centre of the workspace stood a zinc bath of water. The surface of the water made a rainbow with a film of oil. Esme looked at it all, at the cluttered workbench under the window, which, she thought, would have admitted more light with fewer cobwebs, the bike stands supporting various frames, a sturdy table spread with newspaper on which stood cleaning cloths, a can of 3-in-1 oil, and some dismantled machinery that meant nothing to her. There was so much to take in. She did not at first register, against the furthest right-hand wall of the shed, a spreading bed of ashes, in the midst of which lay a small heap of smouldering logs, their lazy smoke drifting up into a brick canopy leading into the flue above. No grate, not even a fireplace in any very structured sense. A large cat lay dozing on the edge of the mound of ashes. Jabez, meanwhile, was picking his way through the clutter of machinery that occupied the periphery of his shop. "I do have a lady's bike, as it happens," he said, "but it may not be what you had in mind. It's here." He moved aside a bike stand supporting a frame with no rear wheel, pushed a coiled length of hosepipe out of the way with his foot, and brought into the space in the middle of the workshop a very elderly bicycle, in admirable condition, but definitely a creation of yesterday. "It's a nice bike." Jabez looked at it thoughtfully. "Got some components added in the 1940s and 50s, but a lot of it's still original. Celluloid covered bars and mudguards, BSA 3-speed hub gear and a panhandle changer, monitor rear brake, a chalice bell, I put that on. I've still got the original saddle, but I thought this one would be more comfortable. New tyres, of course. I mean, I've overhauled it properly. Stripped it down, I cleaned it, done all that was needed and waxed the frame and everything. It just depends, as I say, if that's what you had in mind." Again the bright, swift, amused glance that took in more than it gave away. Esme decided the best course would be to abandon her defensiveness and let him help her. "I don't know anything at all about bikes," she said. "I mean, I can ride one, but I haven't done for years. I just felt I had to get some exercise and lose some weight. Why shouldn't I have a bike like this in mind?" And the honesty seemed to pay off. He looked at her more openly, and this time she saw a kindness that she felt obscurely grateful for. Almost unnoticed, a thought passed the edge of her mind. This man will never cheat me. Modern bikes, like you might get in Barton's Bikes in South Harbour, which I think is also nearer your home for repairs and such, have more sophisticated gears, much lighter aluminium frames. They make for easier cycling, especially on the hills. Cost you more, of course." "What are the prices?" Esme asked him. "Well, Maybe you'll pick up a good modern second-hand bike for £200 if you're lucky and you don't mind waiting. I'd ask you 50 for this, because of the tyres and the work I've done on it. I didn't pay for it. Miss Macpherson had no more use for it, and she sent it along to me in case I could make anything of it. Nice bike, as I say, but you'd use less puff and muscle on a modern job. There's no doubt about it. If I buy this bike from you... Esme hesitated. She had a feeling this was a man who could see through pretence to ulterior motives. Would you maintain it for me? Help me look after it, I mean. Because they need oiling and stuff, don't they? You have to know things. And, which she didn't say, I just love this place and you so intrigue me. I must find a reason to come back. Esme had rightly detected Jabez Ferrell's capacity for insight, but he had a certain humility that prevented him ever imagining Esme to be interested in him. And he was very familiar with other people's inability to care for their own bicycles. It's how I earn my living, he said. I expect you'll find it easier to do all the routine stuff at home, tyre pressures and lubrication, brake blocks and whatnot. But you can always bring it to me for servicing or if you have any problems or the wheels go out of true. Esme looked at him, aghast. I don't think I can do any of that, she said. I'm only just about going to be able to ride it without killing myself. His eyes met hers then with a definite twinkle. Oh, you wouldn't be the only one. I spent most of last Wednesday getting mud and nettle stalks and grass and heaven knows what else out of Mrs. Norman's axles. Mud's a bit out of her sphere of experience, it would seem. Whatever. I can help. Then I'd like it, Esme replied, but I'm not quite sure how I'll get it home. Is there a bus that comes out here from South Harbour? Was, but not since 1973. Oh. Esme felt a bit out of her depth. Well, I expect I could ask someone from the chapel to give me a lift over here, only... He waited and raised his eyebrows at her inquiringly, and to her considerable embarrassment she could feel herself blushing. I'd rather they didn't know I was getting a bike, in case it turns out I never really ride it. I'd feel so silly. Jabez chuckled. Smoker's teeth, Esme registered. Are you sure you want to buy a bike? He said. Why don't you go home and think about it? I'm not likely to sell this in a hurry. And then came a moment of inspiration. Could I come here a few times and watch what you do to maintain a bike, so I'd feel more confident? Jabez didn't reply at once. Yes, I suppose so, he said reluctantly after a moment's hesitation. He seemed a little taken aback. Not if you'd rather I didn't. No, it's all right. It's just people don't come here much. It's a bit of a refuge. Esme took a deep breath. She was unsure how much this man would understand. "I promise not to be people," she said softly, "and I would be very grateful to have temporary admission to a refuge." Jabez shifted his grip on the bicycle frame and looked down at it. "Let me just put this away," he said, and turned from her to reposition the bike against the wall. And having done so, he stayed a moment longer with his back to her, buried his hands in his pockets as he turned again to face her. "You will be welcome," he said, "any time." But it was quietly spoken, and Esme sensed, somewhat costly, a man who deeply valued his privacy. I won't get in the way." Her tone beseeched him, and he sighed, moved his head a little impatiently. He returned the hosepipe to its original position with his foot. He wouldn't look at her. She saw she had imposed too much on his seclusion. "Is any time better than another?" she persisted, ashamed at intruding, but determined not to lose this enchanted place. He shook his head, his gaze averted still. "Any time." The tabby cat rose to its feet among the ashes, elongated its body in a long, shaky stretch, and ambled across the shed to wind itself around his ankles, scattering a light fall of the ash that clung to its fur. It had a purr like a diesel engine. Jabez bent to scratch its head, and the cat raised its chin appreciatively, closing its eyes in slow ecstasy. "Thank you, Mr. Ferrell, for your understanding and your help," said Esme. Straightening, he looked from under his eyebrows at her, appraised her carefully for a matter of seconds. "I expect it had better be Jabez," he said. Esme stowed this treasure in her heart with joy. "How are you? Are you well? Are you okay? What's happening in your day?" "I'm just going to go downstairs and make a cup of tea. We've got on the side and the counter in the kitchen a coconut raspberry tray bake, which I'm going to cut up because I've heard the others coming in from work. And it'll be time for us all to sit down and share a cup of tea together in a minute. How about you? Are you in a household, or are you just by yourself at home? What's happening in your world? How are you finding things? I hope you're well today. God of love, look upon us in your mercy. Touch our lives with your peace. Shape our hearts into the ways of quietness and contentment. Lead us in the path of simplicity and walk alongside us there. Help us through quietness and simplicity and the practice of contentment to find our way home. I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. May this be a good day for you. May there be things in it that make you happy. Go well. God be with you. Nice to see you.